If I were to make a list of things I'd never do in my life, this story would definitely be at the top. But here I am, putting aside all my regrets and fears, deciding to tell you this secret of mine. Because sometimes, there are things you just can't keep inside. And my secret? It was screaming, even in silence. My name is Laura. I'm 38 years old. I have a wonderful husband, a good marriage, and from the outside, a life that others would envy. But not everything is as it seems. The truth is, my life completely changed a few months ago. It all started when my husband Ethan's son from his first marriage, Ryan, moved in with us for the summer. Ryan is 21, handsome, smart, and an impressive young man. At first, I tried to keep a natural distance as a stepmother. But over time, this distance turned into a dangerous closeness in a way I didn't even notice. I remember the moment I first saw him. He was standing at the door, a slight smile on his face, holding his suitcase. There was a strange confidence in his eyes. In that moment, I realized he wasn't just a young guy. Ryan reminded me of something I'd been missing for years. At first, I thought these feelings were just a misunderstanding. After all, this was just a temporary situation, right? But I was wrong. Ethan's frequent business trips, and the fact that Ryan and I were often home alone, made things even more complicated. One day, Ryan looked at me and said, "Laura, I've never felt so at peace in this house." The warmth in his eyes shook me. In that moment, I realized I couldn't stop myself. I thought about the moment Ryan said those words to me over and over again. "I've never felt so at peace in this house." It was such a simple sentence, but the look in his eyes. I'd never felt anything like that before. There was this strange excitement inside me that I couldn't make sense of. I started blaming myself. These feelings weren't right. They shouldn't have been there. But no matter how hard I tried to push them away, I could feel the bond between Ryan and me growing deeper. When Ethan wasn't home, Ryan and I started talking for longer periods of time. At first, it was completely innocent. We'd talk about books, movies, life. But over time, our conversations became more intimate, more personal. One day, while I was making coffee in the kitchen, he walked over and said, "Laura, talking to you feels so good." Our eyes met. My heart started beating faster. Was this a misunderstanding? Or was it just something I was blowing out of proportion in my head? But one night, everything changed. Ethan was on another business trip, and Ryan and I were alone at home. It was raining outside. We were watching an old movie on TV. The space between us kept shrinking, but it wasn't just our bodies closing the distance. It was our conversations, our glances, even our silences that seemed to carry meaning. When the movie ended, Ryan turned to me with a slight smile and said, "Laura, I've never felt so close to anyone." My heart was pounding out of my chest. I didn't know what to say. I should have backed away at this point, but I didn't. I just stayed silent, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. The few seconds of silence felt like years. Ryan reached his hand toward mine, but just then I stood up. "It's late. I need to go to bed," I said. My voice was trembling. Ryan just looked at me, didn't say a word. But the look in his eyes, that look said everything. I couldn't sleep that night. I didn't know what to do, betraying Ethan. I couldn't even imagine it. But at the same time, I felt like staying away from Ryan was nearly impossible. How could I get myself out of this mess? I tried to sleep that night, but I couldn't. Ryan's looks, his words, and even his silence were spinning around in my mind. I kept telling myself to stop, but this feeling was becoming uncontrollable. Everything would go back to normal when Ethan came home, right? But things didn't turn out that way at all. The next morning, we were alone at the breakfast table. The silence between us was almost palpable. After a while, Ryan spoke in a calm voice. "Laura, I'm sorry for my behavior yesterday. If I made you uncomfortable, I apologize." It was a sentence that showed his maturity and sense of responsibility. but at the same time, it opened the door for us to talk about this. I wasn't uncomfortable, I said, my eyes focused on my coffee. But as soon as those words left my mouth, I didn't even believe them myself. From that day on, the conversations between Ryan and me became more careful and measured. But beneath that caution, there was another kind of tension, something that needed to be said, but neither of us had the courage to speak. One day, while Ethan was home, Ryan came up to me in the kitchen and said quietly, "Laura, we need to act like a family in this house, but sometimes I feel like I can't just see you as a stepmother." I took a deep breath to control my feelings. Knowing Ethan was in the next room made everything even more complicated. "Ryan, do you realize what you're saying?" I asked. But as I asked the question, I was questioning myself as well. I should have stopped him, but at the same time, I wanted to understand why this connection was so strong. Ryan's answer was quick and clear. "I know, Laura. But these feelings are consuming me. I just wanted to say something." After this conversation, things became even more complicated. Ryan wasn't openly saying anything to me, but his actions spoke volumes. Ethan's presence forced me to suppress all these feelings, but it was hard to predict where these suppressed emotions would lead us. One night, when Ethan was on a business trip, Ryan came up to me and said, "You know, I really feel at home in this house." There was innocence in his words, but at the same time, they carried a deeper meaning. Seeing how he was dealing with these feelings both intrigued and scared me. It was one of those nights when Ethan was away for a few days on a business trip. The house was oddly quiet. The rhythmic sound of raindrops hitting the window only made the tension inside more apparent. Ryan had retreated to his room, and I was sitting in the living room, battling with my thoughts. Something was bothering me. It was an unease I couldn't explain. Maybe it was the guilt growing inside me, or the pressure Ryan's presence was creating. I went to the kitchen to get a glass of water, trying to pull myself together. Just then, a faint rustling from the garden caught my attention. Our dog, Buddy, was outside, and for some strange reason, he was barking. He was usually a calm dog, but tonight something seemed to be unsettling him. I went outside to see what was going on. After adjusting Buddy's leash, I tried to calm him down. But in that moment, I felt someone behind me. When I turned around, I saw Ryan. "Laura, what are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice calm but also curious. "Buddy was barking at something. I was checking on him," I replied, unable to hide the tremble in my voice. Ryan took a few more steps toward me. "Is everything okay?" "I noticed you seemed a little tense," he said. I couldn't answer that question, because the moment Ryan looked at me, the distance between us wasn't just physical, it was closing emotionally too. Then, the moment he spoke, everything became even more complicated. "Laura, sometimes I feel like everyone here is hiding a secret," he said. The expression in his eyes revealed the confusion inside him. "What do you mean, Ryan?" I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. "I try to ignore some things," Ryan said, looking away from me. "But sometimes, the things you see can change you." In that moment, my heart almost stopped. Was Ryan implying that he had seen something? Or had he just sensed something? Ryan's words were echoing in my head. Sometimes, the things you see can change you. That sentence hit me like a slap in the face. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Ryan, what exactly do you mean?" I asked. He remained silent. He stared at me for a few seconds, as if trying to find the right words. Finally, he sighed deeply and spoke. "Laura, I've watched you a few times. I've observed you. And sometimes, I felt like some things were different than I thought." His words completely cornered me. I couldn't even look him in the eye, unsure of what I'd hear next. "Ryan, whatever you saw or felt, it's something explainable. Please don't jump to conclusions," I said, but my voice was trembling. Ryan took another step closer, his eyes filled with seriousness. "Laura, "I can't control how I feel about you," he said. His words pierced my heart like a sharp knife. What I had been trying to avoid was finally in front of me. "Ryan, this isn't right. You shouldn't feel this way," I replied, but I didn't even believe the strength of my own words, because deep down, I felt like there was no way out of this mess I was in. Just then, I heard the creak of the garden gate hinges. Ethan had returned. Ryan quickly stepped back and gathered himself. I was left frozen, not knowing what to do with my shock and fear. Ethan approached the door, smiling, and asked, "Hey, what are you two doing out here? Isn't it a bit cold to be sitting in the garden at night?" "We were just checking on Buddy's barking," I replied quickly. I hoped my voice sounded normal. Ethan looked at us and said, "Let's go inside. You'll catch a cold out here." As we went back inside, the tension between Ryan and me was still palpable. Ethan didn't seem to suspect anything, but I knew this couldn't last forever. I either had to put an end to the tension between Ryan and me, or... Ethan had left for a business trip out of town. As usual, he prepared early in the morning and left the house, and a feeling of lightness washed over me. But at that moment, no matter how hard I tried to hide it, I couldn't shake the unease within me. The tension between Ryan and me had grown so intense that I could almost feel his presence at any given moment. I told myself several times that I needed to stop. I had to be honest with Ethan, even with myself. But Ryan's gaze, his silence. When everything came together, it destroyed all my logic. Feeling his approach, waiting for the words to slip from his mouth, everything suddenly started to change. That evening, Ryan and I were alone in the kitchen. I decided to say a few words, but my tongue was tied. Ryan made it clear with his gaze that he wanted to get closer. But we still shouldn't have chosen this path, right? What would we say to Ethan? This couldn't stay a secret forever. But in that moment, I realized that everything could change, that these secrets might eventually connect us to each other. "Laura," Ryan said, his voice trembling a little. "I'm noticing something. I know you feel it too. But this feeling, it's as hard as trying to separate ourselves from each other." Something stirred inside me. I was only fooling myself by denying it. Our feelings had always been here, always with us. But there was no point in running from the truth. There was a silence between Ryan and me. It was so deep that it felt like the whole world had gone quiet. For a moment, I felt like I was losing myself, but I pulled myself together. "Yes, Ryan, I accept what I'm feeling," I said. "But I don't know where this will lead us." We looked at each other for a while, saying nothing, but that silence spoke more than anything. Ryan took another step forward, standing next to me. The distance between us had shrunk so much. I thought anything might be possible. "Laura, feeling this way with you scares me," he said. "But running away isn't the solution. Things are going to change, I know that. But sometimes, no matter what happens, you have to let go of something." Tears welled up in my eyes. On one hand, fear. On the other, a confession buried deep within me. I had suppressed my feelings for years, but now, standing before Ryan, no matter how open my heart was, I felt a strange sense of trust. This meant starting something without knowing where it would end. Just then, time seemed to freeze with Ethan's return. The sound of the door gave me chills. Ryan quickly pulled back, and I quickly composed myself and tried to act normally. When Ethan entered the kitchen, he smiled. "What are you two doing here? It's so cold," he asked. We tried to act like nothing had happened. "We were checking on Buddy," I said. But my eyes avoided Ryan's. We both knew something was different. It wasn't exactly a secret between us. It was possibly the deepest and most hidden thing. I thought Ethan didn't suspect anything, but deep inside, I felt a fear. Ryan's feelings for me seemed like they would never fade. There was just one more step left, and maybe no one could predict where it would take us. Something had changed. I could feel it. But how long would this change last? When would it end?